Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello, my guest is Deena Lindstedt. She is an author and has recently written the historical novel Lady of the Play. She was formerly corporate director of statutory benefits with Weyerhaeuser Company and also was the Northwest Claims Manager with EBI Company. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Nancy.
We're going to focus on the environment of the Elizabethan era in England back in the 1500s.
Well, it was pretty miserable.
Apparently, from what I gathered, there was bad sanitation, bubonic plague, other diseases.
Yes. I think water was the biggest problem because they had trouble finding suitable drinking water in the cities especially, and they had open sewers, so they would empty chamber pots right into an open sewer, and then the rains would come and it would wash down into the rivers, and it was pretty bad pollution, which accounted for the diseases that were prevalent during that time. But it was during the Renaissance, and so, people were starting to get pretty wise during that time, the science especially, so they recognized the fact that sanitation was a major problem. Things started to move a little bit towards sanitation, but it had a long way to go.
Some of the conditions that people had, like smallpox, which we've controlled a bit now, were so bad in terms of disfiguring people's faces that Queen Elizabeth I covered her face with white powder to not show those marks.
Right. I understand the powder had some lead in it, so a lot of historians believe that accounted for her strange behavior before she died, which they considered to be very attractive, that white face. They protected themselves from the sun, so they did understand a little bit the sun damage, but tan skin was not a popular thing to have because that indicated that you were poor. And, the class system in England was, well, it's still pronounced to a certain extent, but nothing like it was back 400 years ago.
I absolutely was enthralled by reading your book about the period back there, as well as the current period where some of your characters were trying to determine whether or not Shakespeare actually wrote his plays. And you presented quite a case where it was probably a woman with Shakespeare fronting for her.
Well, that was a common belief that Shakespeare was incapable of being able to write the beautiful prose and poetry that has lasted over time. His education was very flawed, and very little education was not compulsory then, and only the wealthy were educated, and usually by a tutor. Based on William Shakespeare's background, he would not have had those kind of privileges. And since no pages, no original writing has ever been found, there's no way of proving one way or the other who wrote them, other than just through historians doing their own research. But my inclination was that I couldn't understand because women during that time were very subservient to the men. They were considered property, actually, of the father and then of the husband. But my heroine, Elizabeth Trentham, who was the wife of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was an exception. She was very educated. Her family was wealthy, so they had a tutor. There's letters that she has written, poetry that has shown the test of time. So she certainly had the qualifications and the genius to be Shakespeare, along with her husband, Edward de Vere.
You certainly convinced me after reading this, and I kept wondering how much did you create to tell it in a novel format and how much was based on history?
I try to make it as historical as I was able to, the timeline especially. Her 10 years that she served with Queen Elizabeth and the things that occurred during those 10 years, such as the Spanish Armada, the Globe Theater, the things that took place during that time were actually historically accurate. What I had to make up was her life. Based on the plays, I thought these plays, if she wasn't the author, she had to have been the inspiration, because Shakespeare plays, for one thing, are very popular with women. They always have been, and I think the reason why is because the heroines in these plays are very strong, independent women, just exactly like Elizabeth Trentham was, that same sort of independent spirit, refusing to get married because she didn't want to be subservient to anybody.
But back in those days, women weren't even allowed to go see the plays. The plays were performed in the courts so that the women could see them. Women could not act in them. Young men had to perform as women.
Yes, that's right. Or boys,
The heroine of your story, as you indicated, chose at first not to get married, and she ran away from home. And I found the experience of her trying to get to a port most fascinating because the roads were not well marked. She had to go through forests. Describe that environment.
Her father had arranged a marriage for her, as in Taming of the Shrew. If she was being forced to marry somebody she couldn't stand, how much she would have to run away. And to do that, she cut her hair and put on her brother's clothes to pretend to be a boy. And she wanted to avoid the road. Like you said, there weren't very many roads. There was road to London and a road to Scotland. It was called the Old Roman Road, actually. But she was afraid to stay on the road because she was afraid they would discover her. So she thought she could figure out how to cut through this woods, but she didn't realize the woods was a forest. So she manages to get lost, and she's lost for 2 days until she finally finds her way out. By then, her food is nearly gone, and it's raining, and she's bedraggled, and she finally runs across an inn. I tried to be as authentic as I could, and pretty primitive inn with dirt floor and big, huge fireplace where a woman is stirring a stew, and inside the inn are 2 men that are also taking shelter from the rain, and one is Edward de Vere, which is her first meeting of him.
These are just some of the wonderful, delightful stories within the story in your book. I kept wondering what's going to happen next to her, what's going to happen. And eventually she did end up back with her family, and they were living as upper class to the point where the Queen actually traveled. Traveling in those days wasn't so easy. The Queen took about 1,000 courtiers and servants with her and actually took a barge at one point back to London, and that wasn't an easy trip.
No, but Queen Elizabeth was well known for spending her summers traveling around England. Interesting thing about her, whenever she would take residence at somebody's home, they would know ahead of time that she was coming. And some of these households would spend all their money that they had just trying to make way for the Queen. So after she left, they were pretty destitute.
Because you were talking mostly about the upper classes who lived in very large houses, castles, palaces. Occasionally you talked about the inn or other places. But are these homes that you wrote about preserved and protected and open to the public?
Well, some of them are. You know, after the First World War, England had increased its property taxes, so a lot of these royalty people with the lineage or their pedigree that lived in these palaces, they couldn't afford to pay the taxes, so they opened them up to the public as tourist attractions. And so, yes, they are preserved. But some of the smaller houses, too, like, for instance, when I went to England, I really enjoyed visiting Jane Austen's home, and I saw Beatrice Potter, and I find them fascinating, especially there's not so many thatched roofs left, because England is such a rocky country. So many of those homes were made of rock, so they survive.
You have interwoven both an historical period with a modern period. How do you compare the two?
I kind of patterned my story after the book Possessions. It was also made into a movie, and it went back and forth between modern day and a historical time. And I was kind of intrigued with that style of writing. And then I have a writers group. They really like that idea as well. Making the chapters flow from one to another was kind of a challenge, but it's something I really enjoyed doing.
In your book, Lady of the Play, many of the chapters start with quotes from various plays of Shakespeare. In those days, it was tough traveling not just within one's own country, but over into Europe, and you described some of that.
Yes, Edward de Vere, he was Shakespeare as well, and he wanted to take a trip to Europe, especially Italy. Italy, you know, is where the Renaissance started, so they were ahead of England as far as being more civilized. In fact, their plays had women in them. Edward de Vere spent a year traveling in Europe and learning about it, and which is why the Shakespeare Shakespeare plays are set mostly in Europe. The plays parallel his travels, which would account for why he was considered to be Shakespeare. But he died too soon. He died in 1604, and plays were continued to be written and produced up until 1612. Interestingly enough, Elizabeth Trentham, his wife, died in 1612.
You had so many subplots. I kept waiting to see what happened to whom and how people were related and why you tried to present this story that Trentham had written these plays. You pointed out that she presented to the Queen the possibility of using plays as propaganda to encourage patriotism.
Yes. It was during the Spanish Armada, and I'm sure that the Queen was challenged because she was a woman. Could she possibly lead her country when the Spanish were threatening at their shores? And so she had to prove to her people not only that patriotism so that they could increase their taxes, but also to support her as a woman to lead the country. So who better to compare herself with than Joan of Arc? That's kind of how that first play came about. King Henry VI was a play that includes Joan of Arc. In my way of thinking, in my humble mind, I thought, I bet the Queen was responsible for having that play written.
You also had chapters going to the current time where some people were trying to find out who Elizabeth Trentham was, what she might have done if she had written the plays, and you talk about Oregon.
Yes, of course I live here in Oregon, but I interlace the historical chapters with contemporary chapters. And what I've done is I've patterned my heroine, her name is Cynthia Parsons, after the research that I did to prove that Elizabeth Trentham would have been collaborating with her husband to write the play and then continuing on her own after he dies and using Shakespeare, the man, as her front, which is why he is attributed as being the author, even though he wasn't qualified to do it.
The theme of the story is trying to prove that Shakespeare did not write his plays, but that Elizabeth Trentham and the 17th Earl of Oxford wrote these plays. But you also had to learn about the Elizabethan period, what it was like to live in the 1500s.
That's right, yeah.
Did you discover something unusual other than the fact that their water was polluted and they had a lot of diseases?
Well, other than the fact of their lifestyle and the social system of that time, I thought was really interesting. In fact, the research took me so much time. I sometimes did so much research I forgot to write. It was fascinating to me to show how people were treated, from the poor people on up to the royalty, to a certain extent, how that carried over through the ages. And the thing about the English is pedigree was more important than anything, your lineage. But in the United States, we don't go by pedigree, we go by wealth. So the people that have the most money seem to be the privileged people, where in England it was your pedigree.
The stories in your book certainly should be made into a movie, but until then, people can read and enjoy the stories in Lady of the Play. How do they get the book?
The easiest way is to go directly to my website, Deena, D-E-E-N-A, Lindstedt, LINDSTEDT.com, and you can order the book directly from there or wherever books are sold online.
You had so many great stories. I just didn't want to put the book down because I wanted to see what was going to happen to whom and what was going to be discovered and how people were living and how they related to each other. It was really delightful. I enjoyed it so much. I want to thank you so very much for sharing your ideas with us in this unique way through the novel Lady of the Play. Thank you for being my guest.
Well, thank you so much for asking me, Nancy. It's been a real pleasure to meet you, too.
I have been speaking with Deena Lindstedt, who is an author and writer of the historical novel Lady of the Play. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.